I had a leader a few years ago come into our session together and complaining about his team. He's, oh, my team just doesn't get it. I keep coming in telling them they got to step up. They got to step up. I'm like, okay, but what does step up look like? What do you mean by step up?
I heard that you are a world country dance champion. That is so cool. And I wanted to ask you, when did you start dancing and how did you start on your journey as a country dance champion?
Oh my goodness. Well, thanks for first of all for having me here today, Rebecca. And yeah, dancing's kind of my alter ego, if you will. I did not grow up dancing, but I did see my parents dance and thought, oh, that'd be nice to do someday. I married a man who's wonderful, but has absolutely no interest in dance. So when I had kids and put the idea of learning off for a very long time, when I hit my 40s, I was started to realize, you know what? I'm not getting any younger. And if I'm going to do this, I better dive in. So I started doing a few group classes. I started off actually in ballroom. That's my first love. So I took some ballroom classes. I hired a coach. I started competing in ballroom. And then a friend of mine who did some ballroom with me invited me to do country dancing with him, and I'm located out in Calgary, Alberta, so we've got the Calgary Stampede, we've got a very Western theme out here, so I thought, "Well, okay, I'll give it a try." So, we started, training, in country dance, we started attending competitions, which, and the culmination of your year of competitions is Worlds. And so we've been to a few of them. And yes, in 2023, we managed to take the title in our division. So I get to call myself a country dance champion, which is pretty cool. And there's all sorts of levels, though. So I'm still at it and still working with my coach. And actually, it's November right now, and we're preparing for Worlds again in Orlando at the end of December.
Wow, that is so cool, Laura. And I love that your journey started later, not early. You know, a lot of us, maybe we think about dancers, and I have a lot of dancer friends. They probably started out very, very young, or that's what we think of in our minds. But what a great testament to how we can learn things at any age and we can be champions at any age. And I love that you shared that because I think that's a great way for all of us as leaders, managers, great reminder for us and great way for us to think about learning because it's not a there's not a stopping point just because you're not in school anymore, or maybe it's something that you're pursuing later in your career. We can always constantly learn and keep growing.
Absolutely.
I imagine you get a lot of feedback from your coach.
Uh-huh. Who knew there was a quarter of an inch difference in your hand position and your foot position? Absolutely, because that's how we learn and grow, is by getting feedback, and otherwise, we're in a feedback vacuum, and just with our sort of blinders on, because we have our own perspective that we're walking through the world with, and it's very interesting as well on the dance floor. What I think looks good in my head, I look in the mirror, it does not look good. So, what I think I'm putting on the floor, I'm not really doing, and so obviously I can get feedback from being in a mirror, or I can get that feedback directly from my coach who's really great at balancing, "Here's what's working, here's what's not, here's what we can do different."
So taking that into the leadership realm, because I love how you describe it as that mirror, right? We do not need that mirror. The image we have in our heads probably isn't what other people might perceive. Perspective is so key. I know we'll talk a little bit more about all of that. Why is feedback important in business and for leaders to be really good at strengthening that muscle?
Yeah, that's a great question. Feedback is imperative in business. Leaders, they're leaders, they're leading a team, and their team is there. If it's a small business owner, for example, their team is there to execute on the business, whatever type of business it is. And so they're professionals. They've obviously learned, they've gone to school, learned the skills, been hired for their skill set, but it's impossible to know everything. There's just too much to know. And in fact, if you were to look at it in a big circle, what we know is just a pinpoint of what's possible. And it's so feedback is about bringing light, bringing awareness to what we don't know. And so a leader is in a perfect position. A leader is there to see the big picture of the company, of the organization, see the vision, know what's coming, and is there to inspire and direct the team members to pursue that. So the team had their different roles. The team is there to execute, the leader is there to lead and direct. And part of that role is to give people feedback, useful feedback, so that they can see themselves differently, see the organization differently, understand and have context for where the organization or the company is going, and then be able to step into that and fulfill. So that's why feedback is so important. And in my work, coaching business owners and senior level executives, I find that um, they struggle to give feedback because their feedback is too vague, and the people that are receiving the feedback don't know what to do with it because it's too vague. So it's a real challenge in the workplace.
I have heard that from other folks as well, whether they're coaches or they are the employee, and they find that they either don't see or agree with the feedback, or because it is so vague, like you said, they don't know what to do with it. Feel They end up feeling more lost in a sea of feedback with no real direction. So how do you deliver feedback in a way that is crystal clear? And maybe that question is a little premature because maybe there's something that has to come before that. But I am curious as we dive into this deeper, what does crystal clear feedback look like?
Crystal clear feedback is all about being very specific, and it's also about being specific about behavior. Where the vagueness and the lack of clarity comes from is when we're using terminology that's either jargon or too vague. So, for example, I had a leader a few years ago come into our session together and complaining about his team. He's, "Oh, my team just doesn't get it. And I keep coming in telling them they got to step up. They got to step up." I'm like, okay, but what does step up look like? What do you mean by step up? He had an idea in his mind about what step up meant, but no one on his team knew what that meant. And so he's getting all frustrated and irritated because, they're not performing the way he wants them to perform. But we had to look at how he was communicating that feedback because he wasn't being clear. And because he wasn't being clear, he wasn't getting back what he wanted. So that was a big aha for him, that we had to get out of the jargon and stop talking about, "Ooh, you got to step up," and get very specific. And specific means regarding a report, for example, that this is a way a report needs to be addressed, or this is how it needs to be written, or a proposal. This is how a proposal should be handled, and very specific versus, this sucks, do it again. Mm.
Yeah, it it almost makes me think too, there's a perhaps to your point, a lack of definition in the jargon as well, because there could be technical jargon that we don't wanna assume, but might all understand within a company. But when you do use those vague jargon or colloquial phrases, that's where that confusion lies, is what it sounds like. So how do you help people with the language generate a little bit more awareness for how their words create an impact or create confusion in that way?
It is about being specific on behavior, but even before we get into being specific about a behavior all that needs changing, what I like to teach my leaders to do is I give them a structure for delivering feedback. Because it's also important to, often we've been receivers of feedback when something's going wrong. And so we view, first of all, feedback as criticism. So leaders, I find, often avoid giving feedback because they don't want to hurt somebody's feelings. They don't know how to say it, or they don't want to sound bad. And we forget. So yes, feedback needs to be constructive, absolutely, and feedback can be positive beyond just saying, "Hey, good job," because that again is vague feedback. We can be specific with behavior. So, an example of that would look like I like to give leaders a template for how to language their feedback. So, a template that I teach people to use is when you did this, I felt this because. And the because part is really important because that piece speaks to the impact that person's behavior is having on the leader, on the team, on the organization. So, for example, a leader might say, when you gave me the report back early, that's the behavior. I felt um, I felt less stressed, and because I had the opportunity to review the report and feel prepared going into my meeting that day. So it's very clear and specific feedback about what the person did, how the person experiencing it felt, and then the impact or change that that behavior had on the individual. So that's an example of giving positive feedback. We can do the same thing with its constructive feedback. So, for example, I just experienced this situation this week with a client. She works with a team of engineers and they're not doing their timesheets because they think, it's just a timesheet. What's the big deal? So, but she needs to explain to them when you don't give me your timesheets on time, that's the behavior. I get stressed, I get flustered, I can't get invoices out on time. And if I can't get invoices out on time, the company doesn't get paid, and that actually impacts our ability to pay you. It's like, that puts timesheets that seem like a silly little thing into a way different perspective. Then, these guys on the team understand that it's not just a timesheet, it's about a much bigger issue. And then they understand if I want to get paid, I got to submit my timesheets.
Well, I love that you mentioned, Laura, the importance of positive feedback and praise. That is feedback and constructive feedback. And that tells me that we probably need to work on the culture in our company and creating an environment where people feel the importance of feedback and the necessity of it. So, how do you start from the beginning, and maybe this is with clients, or maybe this is something that we as leaders can take back to our companies, but how do we start to build that culture where feedback isn't scary? It's not about you did something wrong, but it's something that we can all use for continuous improvement.
Yeah, a great question because feedback can be a part of the culture. Absolutely. I love that you brought the idea of culture to play. It is absolutely a part of the culture. How we do that is by doing it, is by delivering feedback. And a great way to start is giving the positive feedback. People want to know that they're making a difference, they're contributing to the team or to the organization in a good way. So, the theory actually says that we should be giving 5 pieces of positive feedback for every 1 piece of constructive feedback. So there's actually a ratio of like 5 to 1. And the reason why that ratio is so important is because, and I'm sure you've probably been the receiver of positive feedback over the years, is for one, we're not used to receiving it. And sometimes, unfortunately, we don't believe it, so it doesn't sink in. So often, positive feedback just kind of slips off, like off us, like, as if we're Teflon. But the constructive feedback or critical oh, that sticks in our heads, and so because, that's just human nature, we can actually have a part in reversing that or impacting that in our companies by remembering to give that positive feedback. And it's tricky sometimes because business owners, managers, they're always looking for the next problem to solve. And it's so easy to forget what's working and just go on to the next issue. So it's super important to, as part of building a culture, start with giving positive feedback and appreciation, acknowledgement, because that actually builds relationship as well between the individuals. So if you got a manager as a team member, for example, giving the kudos builds and strengthens the relationship. I call it like putting deposits in the relationship bank account. Because then when it is time to deliver some more constructive feedback, sometimes that constructive feedback feels like you're taking, you're withdrawing from that bank account a little bit. But if you've built the balance up and you've got a good, strong relationship with that person, then they're going to be much more able to hear it. They're going to be much more open, and their feedback isn't going to become, oh, it's always just the bad news. So that's a really powerful place to start building that culture.
I'm so glad you mentioned relationship because I agree, you're right. It is about strengthening a better relationship. When you have a stronger culture, you can build that rapport a whole lot better. And I'm curious what you think about team resistance to feedback. If that dissipates, does that disappear when we have those stronger relationships? Is it easier for leaders to approach that?
Absolutely, it can dissipate over time. I think leaders have to remember that their team members have a history. Their previous employers, the homes that they grew up in. And as children, we get feedback from our parents, that isn't always so positive. So we have experiences there that whether we want to or not, we're bringing into the workplace. And our previous work experiences, if we have had negative experiences with receiving feedback, it's just natural that someone is going to bring that history into their current workplace. That's kind of human nature. So if a leader can be really thoughtful and intentional about the culture that they want to create, understand that people have their history, and it's obviously not their rule to diagnose their team members or provide therapy or any of that kind of stuff. But where they can really start is helping their employees know that the organization is a safe space for them to grow professionally, grow personally. And so that safe space is part of that culture, that this is a place where we acknowledge and we appreciate each other and we um, want to have really strong, positive relationships. Now, not everything's gonna be a bed of roses all the time. There is going to be those situations where maybe someone is underperforming or has done something that's been ineffective, and so there are going to be absolutely those times that we have to have those conversations as well. But I think if we start with the acknowledging and working on what's working, then it makes having conversations about what's not working easier when it comes time to do it because we're already used to delivering feedback, and it makes it much easier for the person to hear it.
And I love that you have a framework for both types of feedback. So, when implementing that, Laura, is there a frequency that a manager leader should be mindful of in delivering feedback? Do you have an approach to the time between what's being observed or what's happening and when that feedback should be delivered?
I don't think there's a hard and fast rule on frequency. It's just notice. Right? this could be, maybe it's on a daily basis, maybe it's on a weekly basis. There's no real hard and fast rule that way. It's really about noticing, being aware. As a leader, watch what's going on around you and see what people are doing. If they've done something that's made a difference in your day, or that has made a difference in somebody else's day, then yeah, acknowledge that. So that people, because like I said, people want to know that they're making a difference. They don't want to be a cog in a wheel. They want to know that they're having an impact. And so by helping them understand that they've had an impact in some way, even if it's after the fact. An example that comes to mind for me is perhaps a leader has received a report from one of their team members. They've taken that report off to a board meeting. And because the report was so comprehensive and detailed, it made it easier for those board members to understand the information in the report. And so maybe that leader wants to come back to that team member and say, hey, thanks so much. I took your report to the board meeting. It was super clear. The rest of the board members understand it, and they were able to make a better and faster decision because of your report. So I think there's opportunities everywhere, every day, if we go looking for them.
That's a great point. It's a self-awareness and it's an awareness of the team member too, and the opportunities like you mentioned. I love that because I believe as leaders, we need to be looking for those opportunities to coach and encourage. Also, makes me think too, well, even approaching a conversation of feedback, whether it is praise or whether it is something constructive, that can actually set a great tone for a good conversation or it can set a bad tone. We have a team working dynamic guide, if you will, and it outlines how we can work best collaboratively together. And one of those items that we like to mention is when you need to speak to someone, don't use the phrase, we need to talk. Because and personally, I don't use this too. Something that I make sure that I'm careful of because I think that sends a trigger of anxiety through everybody to hear, "We need to talk," or "Let's talk." And I've even been in those situations, and sometimes the talk is positive, and it's like, "Oh, I was for nothing." Yeah. And sometimes it is constructive feedback, and I've almost wished personally that it's been a conversation of, "Hey, I want to talk to you about X," or, "Hey, let's talk about Y." So that's something I'm very mindful of because I've experienced that anxiety and that buildup, anticipation, and I like to be careful of that with my team too, especially because 'cause we're remote. But whether you're remote or in person, how you're approaching someone, both physically and I would think verbally, matters. So if I'm a leader and I don't have that awareness of even getting to the feedback, what would you guide me or anyone to take those steps and to do it in a way that's mindful and meaningful?
Yeah, that's a great question. I think what we've been talking about already, the idea of giving people positive feedback regularly, when we're doing that, then oh, we need to talk can be, the person hearing that can be a little less reactive, hopefully. Because, and what I recommend to my leaders is just what you were just describing. Be clear on your intention. That's always the first step on delivering feedback. Be clear on your intention with the other person. So that might look like, I'd like to have a conversation. I noticed something in your work the other day, and I'd like to have a conversation about that because I think there's an opportunity for us, using inclusive language, to make it better. So that sets the tone right there and sets an intention that, something has come up, the leader has noticed something, and the intention is to help, be helpful, make something better. So I think that can soften, bringing the intention of the conversation, stating that right up front, softens the other person a little bit and helps make them more open to the conversation. And I think it's also very important for a leader to ask permission. Sometimes the leaders or something's happened and it's got to be dealt with right away. And they just kind of burst on the scene and we got to talk now. And that's not very respectful of the person you're delivering feedback to. So we have to show up in a respectful way. Say, I'd like to have a conversation about this situation, that came up or something that I noticed the other day. When would be a good time for you? When are you available to have this conversation with me? So that they ask permission to have the conversation, they set a time to have the conversation, they had now have set intention to have the conversation. So those are kind of the first few steps there. And then once they're actually in the room with the person, and I think feedback conversations are important, and especially constructive feedback conversations are important to have one-on-one. It's, again, respectful. We don't want the person to feel singled out in their team. We've got some teams work in bullpens, if you will, and so it's really, positive feedback, deliver in the bullpen. Absolutely. Let everybody hear it. But those more private conversations, I think need to happen one on one. And obviously, if you're working remote, then you can get online with each other and have that one on one. And once we're in the physical or virtual room, with the person, we can reiterate our intention. I noticed something the other day, and so I'd like to bring this to your attention because I think there's a way that we can do it better. Here's what I noticed. And that I noticed whether it's a behavior. I noticed in the team meeting the other day that you were very quiet or seemed upset about something. Was something going on for you? Or I noticed, this report isn't up to your usual standard. You're usually much more detailed than this. So I'm wondering if there's, something going on for you because it's not how you usually approach things. And so we bring the issue of concern to the table and then open it up for conversation. And if we notice the person on the receiving end of the feedback starting to get defensive, because that can happen, then it's really important for the leader to stop their feedback conversation and switch gears. Because if they keep trying to push their agenda, the person is likely just to get more and more defensive. And I call it their emotional temperature is going to go up and their ability to hear is going to go down. So a leader needs to stop briefly, say, "Hey, I noticed you're getting a little defensive now. Did I trigger something for you? Is something coming up for you right now?" And address the defensiveness. Because if they can do that, then the person feels heard, and their emotional temperature will come down, and then the leader can come back to the original issue and revisit it when the person is in a calmer state. So that's an important element of feedback delivery as well, is really noticing the action or reaction in the person you're speaking with and um, being attentive to that and addressing it versus just staying on your own agenda.
That's so helpful, Laura, because you're describing to me how we can care personally about the person, and having that awareness again helps us realize that we're not talking to robots, right? We're talking to people, and having that compassion and empathy while you're talking to them. And I feel like maybe that's easily missed when we do go in, whether it's full force, full energy. I have something to share with you. We forget that it's to the benefit the other person, not maybe to benefit the company. Yeah, absolutely. But it's really so that the other person can improve. And to your point, if we're just focused on our agenda, we're probably not, as leaders, going to have the same impact. So when it comes to being able to recognize those signs, are there behavioral cues, sort of visual cues, or anything that you would have us look out for that would indicate maybe it's not the best time to have this conversation? Maybe we're going to venture into that defensive mode and it's time to pivot, pivot, pivot. We gotta adjust here.
Yeah, I mean, there's usual, like, physical cues, where we notice someone kinda shutting down and me sitting back and, getting into a tense position that, that's kinda can be a common physical cue. But yeah, there's usually physical, or even verbal cues that, the person's gonna start the defensiveness may sound like, "Well, it wasn't my fault, so and so didn't give me their stuff on time," and so they start defending themselves, they start explaining themselves or coming up with all kinds of stories about why and how something happened. And those stories is just another example. It is defensiveness. And so it's an opportunity for the leader to say, whoa, 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 time out for a second. I'm sensing that maybe you're feeling a little attacked right now. And what I'm describing right now is a skill called active listening. And so this is where the leader needs to sense, observe, be aware of the reaction in the other person and say, I sense that, maybe you're feeling a little attacked. I just want to remind you, I'm not trying to attack you right now. And this is not about something being wrong or you being wrong. This is about a situation, or this is about this report and us making it better. So, absolutely, there's going to be cues that if the leader is paying attention, the leader's going to notice them. It's either gonna be verbal or it's going to be physical mannerisms. The leader's gonna notice, and the leader needs to notice and pay attention and, like I said, switch gears into that noticing, the active listening of the words, of the behavior, so that the person's emotional temperature can come down again, so then the leader can get back to the original agenda of the conversation. Does that answer your question?
It does, and thank you for mentioning active listening because that can be so hard for us. And you already mentioned being observant and having that awareness. Are there any other ways that we can be better at active listening or practice that to get better at it?
Practice, practice, practice.
Yeah.
All the skills that I'm mentioning today are all in a fabulous book. I love tools and resources. I'm always finding the best tools out there for my clients. So, what we're talking about today is all material and skills that are talked about in a book called Leader Effectiveness Training. And it's not new material. It was, written probably 30 years ago. But this is material that I actually got certified in a number of years ago. And it's all communication skills. So LET, Leader Effectiveness Training, it's available as an audiobook, as a physical book, and it's fabulous for helping a leader, understand these dynamics, understand how to practice active listening. I think the hardest part about practicing active listening is getting over the discomfort of it in the beginning because it doesn't feel natural. Uh, because really, active listening is about paraphrasing back to someone how we are experiencing them or what we're hearing from them or seeing from them in the moment. And so it feels a little weird in the beginning. But if we give ourselves permission to feel awkward and practice it anyways, we can give a tremendous gift to our direct reports or to our colleagues because it really is active listening that gives someone an experience of being heard, of being respected. And when someone he feels heard, that's what creates the safe space that we were talking about earlier. So it's super powerful. It's not as difficult as people think it is. The hardest part is getting over our own discomfort with giving it a try. But once we do, it's an amazing skill to bring to the table.
Now, Laura, I've heard you mention the words noticing what we're observing as leaders in our team members. And that makes me curious. Is there a reason why you approach that feedback with observations and noticing in order to set the tone or that structure?
Absolutely. it's interesting that I'm actually thinking for a minute here with your question because for me that's it's kind of unconscious that I speak about it this way, and now you're making me think about it for a minute. Um, but yeah, so I think again I was having this conversation this week with one of my clients because he comes to the conversations with me, which means I'm sure he's coming to conversations with other people using lots of what I call you language. You did this or you did that or you know when. And so second person language is not accountable language. So that whole noticing is about actually we notice and then we switch. We don't talk in you language. We use I language. I observed, I noticed, I experienced, I saw this report, blah, blah, blah. Um, it really, when we can switch into I language, a couple of things happen. I language is more accountable language for the leader. They are now owning their experience. And especially in the issue of feedback, if we're saying to someone, you did such and such, that is a way that can be a trigger for that defensiveness. Because as soon as we're saying you, someone can start to feel blamed. So that's why we need to switch it, into that I language. And another reason to not use you language, even in a compliment, like we were talking about earlier, acknowledgement. You did a great job on that report. Well, it's easy because it's easy for the person, like that's an example where they might stuff that compliment off or not let it sink in because the leader's not sharing their experience of the person. So it sounds subtle, but it's a big difference when a leader can say, I appreciated that report being done early because now the leader is sharing their experience of the person, which the other person can't dispute because it's the leader's experience. And I remember simple example. I'm going to take you way back to my high school days. I remember someone once upon a time saying, "Oh, that dress looks good on you," and I just dismissed it because they were talking in second person, and it was easy for me to slough it off. Versus if a person says, "I like that dress on you," I can't dismiss that because now they're sharing their experience of me. So when we can shift from you language into I language or inclusive language like we, when we do this, and this is going to help benefit us, uh, it changes how the receiver receives that information and it changes the experience. Absolutely.
Such a subtle difference, but what an impact. And I appreciate you highlighting that for us because it's probably something we A, have to be aware of. Again, that awareness. B, I would imagine it's very easy for us to use that second person, you, because we were probably thinking, well, I'm talking to the person and it's about them. And I've heard it framed in different ways before, but I've never thought about it in terms of the experience that what we're experiencing and how we're sharing that with them. And so I love how you explain that and put that. And I hope, anyone listening will all be extra mindful in our speech, whether we are complimenting someone or otherwise. It also makes me wonder too, Laura, we all might have different learning styles and different ways that we absorb information. So, are there different approaches to feedback for a particular type of learner that you're aware of, or any kind of frameworks or structures that you like to be mindful of if you're met with someone who might be more accustomed to receiving feedback a certain type of way?
Yeah, I don't think learning styles of the receiver is super important. What I do find though, I'm going to actually circle back to what we talked about earlier in regards to active listening, because sometimes when we're delivering a message as a leader, we're we can't know if the receiver is hearing what we're intending they hear, because the leader has a thought in their head, and that thought kind of goes through the filter, and then that thought comes out as words, but then those words are heard by the receiver and go through their filter and then become whatever message it becomes in their head. So, what I think is actually what would be helpful for leaders when they're delivering feedback is, rather than just end the conversation when they feel like they've said what they need to say, a powerful question to ask the person they're speaking with is to say, "So, what are you walking away with? What is your understanding of our conversation? What have you heard me say today?" And which gives then the receiver an opportunity to active listen the leader, paraphrase what they've heard, which gives the leader an opportunity to know, have they been clear, or is the receiver not hearing what they wanted them to hear? Because sometimes a leader may think that they are delivering some feedback in the most gentle, kind, respectful, empathetic way, but because of the filter that the receiver has, the receiver, for lack of a better word, is kind of twisting it into something completely different, in their mind, and is making up a whole different story about what they're hearing and what their leader is saying to them. So it's very important for the leader to ask that question: What's your takeaway from this? What have you heard me say?" Because if the recipient of the feedback is saying, "Oh, I'm hearing that you think I suck or that I'm terrible at my job," but the leader has an opportunity to say, "Whoa, whoa, 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 that's not what I meant to share. Let's clarify. Let's revisit this before we end this conversation."
That's a great question to ask. And that actually is a great segue to formula because I think we as leaders are thinking about feedback, we also shouldn't probably forget the follow up too. And if you're setting up a person for success, that takeaway question is gold. That's great advice because now we're getting their feedback on our feedback.
Yes. Mhm.
And then I would imagine that sets us up for action items or some set plan if it is a constructive conversation for improvement. How do you like to follow up on that constructive type of feedback so that the feedback isn't given and then forgotten if it is that learning moment for the team member?
That's a brilliant question, Rebecca, and you're so right. Is something we have the conversation, and so yes, the active listening, and making sure that the communication has been clear, then does naturally segue it into, what are the action steps to follow to come out of that? Because ultimately, feedback is about changing behavior, doing something differently. So we have the conversation, we've confirmed clarity. Now the person understands, oh, they need to do something different next time. So the leader can, I like advising my leaders to say, ask their feedback recipients. So what are they taking away? What are they gonna do with this feedback? What's gonna be different next time? So that the recipient creates their own action steps, because those are more likely to stick than a leader saying, "Well, you need to do this different next time." So have the recipient plan their action steps and then negotiate with the recipient of the feedback. Okay, great. You said you're going to do this differently. Got it. So when will we create a check in, book it. So should we check in with each other 2 weeks from now, a month from now? But definitely plan to revisit it. Don't just let it drift, because then you're setting up a situation where the follow through might not happen. If we book a follow up conversation, then we're more likely to get the follow through that we're looking for. So I think that raises a great point, Rebecca, and that's really important for how we get the feedback to sink in, how we get action taken on it, and get in that follow up conversation. Then we have an opportunity to look at, did the feedback work? Did this plan that we came up with, was it effective? Because sometimes the actions are gonna work, and sometimes they might not, and we have to revisit the original issue and come up with a new plan. So, super important.
That's great advice. How do you track that if you're remote? You might have more practices and good habits in terms of writing down communication in a chat like Slack or Teams, and in person that might not be as quickly available. So do you encourage leaders and employees to have a system for tracking their feedback, for tracking their team members' progress over time?
Oh, now you're into a whole new conversation. A simple answer, take a few notes,
Mm.
have a journal, if you want, like, both parties can have a journal, block. If you're gonna say, "Yep, let's follow up in 2 weeks," it's like, "Great, get the calendars out and book it in your calendars and know when you're gonna have that, follow-up conversation." And then if they wanna take it to a whole other level, then there are tools, like, EOS out of Traction and BOS, which is a tool called 90, which piggybacks on Traction, that have whole systems around feedback delivery and documentation and staying on top of that kind of stuff. So, your question is a bit of a can of worms question, but the quick answer is yes, take some notes, book your follow up, and put it in your calendar.
I love that. Well, I'm sure folks listening can explore those options at their leisure, but that's really good start for anyone who's curious. You could take that very simple quick action approach. I love booking the next meeting in my calendar before I leave a meeting. I think that's really helpful just for someone like myself who can forget things if I don't write it down. And to your point that you can take it that next level if and should you need to. Now, I want to flip the table a little bit and the conversation with the time that we have left and chat about giving feedback to your boss, to your leader. And I'll preface this, Laura, with a short story. I remember being in a conference and we had the wonderful opportunity of hearing Kim Scott speak on her, at the time, new book, Radical Candor. And she was talking in the moment of that story about how she was encouraging bosses and leaders to receive feedback. And I was with a group of folks, some of them in authority over me, and I could feel the tension and it was building in that talk. And, since then, I've been very mindful and I've experienced this with other leaders, great leaders who are equally mindful. How do we get the insight and the feedback we need to do better so that we do have that, to your earlier points, awareness of ourselves? And I know that that's a very uncomfortable situation for a leader who's not used to that to be in. Or that maybe their team members aren't used to or comfortable giving them feedback. So, all of that, long story long, to preface that question of how do we get feedback as leaders in a healthy, respectful way?
That is a fabulous question, and I think it starts with the leader, first of all, being open to it. Uh, Lots of leaders that I talk to will acknowledge that actually that it's lonely at the top, and that they are sometimes and are often in feedback vacuums. So there's lots of ways to get feedback. They can get feedback from colleagues by asking for it. They can get feedback from mastermind groups. They can get feedback from hiring a coach, for example. And they can get feedback from their team members who are experiencing them on a day to day basis if they are open to it. I think that actually circles back to the beginning of our conversation, which is about, are you creating a culture of feedback in your organization? Because yes, a leader needs to be effective at delivering feedback, but they can also send the message to their team members of, I'm open to receiving, and really just reinforce that message all the time. And not just because they say it once doesn't mean it's going to sink in, that their direct reports are going to take advantage of it, because remember, those direct reports have come from other environments and other types of feedback cultures when maybe it wasn't cool to give the boss feedback. But yeah, so it starts with the boss being open to it and communicating that they're open to it. And then the direct report has to be brave enough one day to say, "Hey, boss, I got a little feedback about that team meeting the other day. Are you open to hearing it?" Asking permission. And then the leader gets to say, "Absolutely, bring it on," kind of thing. So yeah, it always starts with us and our openness and our willingness. And I think a lot of leaders that get into their position and they put pressure on themselves to think that they have to have the answers all the time and that they have, because they're the boss, they, have to know everything and can't be vulnerable. And I think that's mistaken thinking. And they leaders are people too. They're human. It's impossible for them to have all the answers, and they need feedback. And again, if they want to take feedback to even the next level, there are 360-degree um, assessment tools out there that are specific for leaders. They can be anonymous, even where the 360 tool is set up where the leader can receive feedback from direct reports, from colleagues, from their upper management, so that they can get the whole idea, a 360 view uh, of how other people are experiencing them. And that type of assessment will identify how they're coming across, what their strengths are, and where some of their weaknesses or challenges are, so that then the leader can choose what areas in that feedback they would like to address. So there's lots of ways and lots of tools if the leader is open.
Thank you for all of those, Laura. Those are great ideas and can help equip us better to lean into the discomfort of asking and receiving it. Do you have any quick questions that you would share with us that we as leaders can take back to our team if we're just getting started and we want to ease into asking for that feedback that you would use for yourself or for others?
Oh, that is a good question. A question about questions. Um, I think if a leader's going to ask questions of their team, again, be ask for specific questions. Like they don't want to ask, like, "How am I doing today?" or "How's it going?" or kind of thing. It's like, "Tell me, tell me how you've experienced me today." And or maybe debrief a team meeting, for example. And they could ask very specifically, "When I was explaining such and such, did it seem clear or did I leave points out or was something confusing for you?" So the quality of the feedback the leader may get or is going to be dependent on the quality of their question. So if they ask a specific question, um, "What was it like to have this conversation with me today?" That's a very specific question. Then they're more likely to get better quality feedback. And they still have to remember that people struggle to give feedback. And so a leader might say, what was your experience of this conversation today? And the direct report might say, "Oh, it was good. Well, I'm fine." So, and to not get discouraged by that, maybe take time to try to ask again or try another angle, because again, people just aren't used to giving and receiving really effective feedback. So, it, give it time, be patient, do more reading and learning on the topic. Because it's so powerful, it's worth doing. It's worth the investment.
Well, as you mentioned, Laura, it starts with us, and I love that. And I love that you have that open mindset. Back to what you were saying just now, too, the detail of the question, the clarity of the question is as equally important as our clarity in how we're receiving or delivering feedback overall, too. And that's going to impact how we receive it. And I can only imagine that if we are skilled or become more skilled at asking questions, we're going to inevitably train our team to also become clearer in how they share their insights and their feedback for us. So I love that you brought us back full circle to the beginning where we started chatting about those details in the culture. And it really does truly come down to us. So, Laura, my question for you is how can people connect with you so that you can get this fabulous coaching and all of your advice and wisdom and practical tips.
Well, thanks for asking. I love to have these kinds of conversations. Communication in general and feedback is so powerful. Like I said, I've got some training in this area and love to work with people on this in addition to other leadership and business skills. So people can find me at my website, which is venturecoaching.ca because I'm in Canada. If they do come to my website, there are all kinds of freebies there that talk about feedback. There's ebooks there they can download about feedback, about communication, about a number of topics. And there's ways to connect with me on my website. They can even book a free session with me. Like I said, I'm always happy to have the conversation. So there's my website. I'm on LinkedIn. Just look for Laura Watson or Venture Coaching. I've got a YouTube channel as well where I've done other podcasts like this, focusing on other topics. So I'm out there, and if they could search my name, search my company, I'm pretty easy to find.
I love that, Laura. Thank you so much for diving deep into this conversation with me for our audiences today. I do hope everybody will take you up on the offer for the freebies. I was actually going to download all those for myself and my team because you really have packed a lot of value in your website. And I can only imagine that all the folks that you are coaching and helping, they are feeling that value on a regular basis. So I do hope that our audiences here will take you up on that offer and connect with you further.
Thanks so much, Rebecca. It's been great to be here today. And yes, I hope people have gotten some value from our conversation.
Thank you so much for connecting with me. And thank you all who are listening to the Bad Bosses, Great Leaders podcast. We'll catch you on the next one. But until then, have a great journey.